Hello and welcome to Introduction to Fine Arts, lecture number 17, Renaissance and Reformation in Northern Europe. We're going to step back just a bit as we change our focus geographically. While the Renaissance was going on in Italy, a lot was happening in the north as well. Religion and politics were the biggest influences on culture, and trends that culminate in the Protestant Reformation and a movement towards centralized governments in Northern Europe. Regarding art, patronage is made up of royalty, church, nobility, and also private individuals. And two types of art were prominent, printmaking and, in particular, oil painting. But painting really reigned supreme, as the age of painting applied to the north as well. The development of oil paint in particular was really suited to the style of Northern Europe, where they still had remnants of the pre-Roman love for detail. The North had always been about fine details in their art, going back as far as we have records for. So, and this is maybe the biggest thing that separates them from the Italians and the Southern Europeans in general when it comes to painting. It's detail. Oil paint made hyper-realistic details possible. Why, you might ask? One thing is slow drying time. You could work and then rework and then rework some more. There was no rush. And it also allowed for a wide range of viscosities in the paint, depending on the additives you put into it. It would also made for very smooth blending and gave you the capability for unprecedented subtlety. The 15th and 16th centuries saw important scientific and cultural advances, two of which include the printing press, which we'll discuss in a bit. Also, cartography improved vastly, meaning exploration and colonizing distant lands was a safer bet than it had been before. Nicholas Copernicus put out his theory of a sun-centered universe versus the traditional Earth-centered one. And his ideas were based on mathematical harmony, not scientific observation, although Galileo later on would confirm his notion of the Earth revolving around the sun later on. But the point I want to make here is the fact that that called into question fundamental Christian doctrine. It's literally a contradiction with what it says in the Bible if you take the Bible literally. It also meant that humans aren't the center of the universe after all. And this is among many of the important cultural issues raised at the time. And a writer like Thomas More, who created social criticism disguised as fiction. This is a way to kind of lure in the reader and is more effective than writing essays. And it was really popular. And that tradition, of course, continues to this day. But his concept of utopia, this lofty image of the perfect society, is modeled on Plato's Republic. It was an inspiring image of a perfect society. This concept of utopia recurs with leaders throughout all of Western culture. And it can have a dark side as well, because if you're talking about a perfect society, kind of begs the questions, perfect for whom? And by what means should you strive for a perfect society? And strict interpretations of this often end badly. Think about Vladimir Lenin or Adolf Hitler were both utopian in their vision. But the person arguably who had the biggest effect on culture and society in Northern Europe, 1500s, is Martin Luther. And of course, this is about the Protestant Reformation. We discussed Martin Luther last chapter briefly. His ideas took hold in the North way more than in the South, and this was due to politics as well as religion. But his revolution didn't begin as a split from the church, but rather just demands for reform, and then grew into a split. These attitudes capitalized on years of pent-up resentment of the church. The church was seen by the public as corrupt and privileged, and Northern Europeans were particularly disenchanted by some practices of the church. And keep in mind, the center of church power was very far away from them, geographically speaking. And there was a brewing dissatisfaction in the air. The extreme wealth of the papacy and its ostentatious displays didn't help win many hearts either. So we have Martin Luther, most famous of several significant protesters, and the first one to really bring the issue to a boil. His 95 Theses, we talked about earlier, posted to the door of a church in Wittenberg in 1517, enumerated objections to various practices of the church, and his ideas were widely disseminated because of the relatively new invention of the printing press. He became the first best-selling writer. He believed that only the scriptures could be the basis for Christianity. And he said that the Catholic Church corrupted the religion, that the structure of the church itself had no basis in biblical teachings. And he was disgusted especially with the sale of indulgences, where people were essentially buying their way into heaven. He also didn't agree with the sacrament of the Eucharist, of the transubstantiation, where the bread and wine literally transform into the body and blood of Jesus. He studied the Bible and disagreed with much of church practice because it wasn't mentioned there. And he wrote popular texts on religious reform. He was then brought before the Inquisition to be tried for heresy, which is when he says this quote that's pictured here, "Here I stand, I cannot do otherwise." The authorities would have liked to have put him to death, but by then his popularity and political clout was so strong that they just didn't dare. As I said earlier, Martin Luther didn't intend to create a whole new version of Christianity, but that's what eventually happened. And it's hard to overstate the significance of the printing press here. Not only did it allow radical new ideas like Martin Luther's to be disseminated to a wide audience, but it also allowed for mass production of the Bible itself, now translated into the common language that lay people could themselves read. Remember, part of what the Renaissance brought was a greater amount of education. More people could read at this point. Taken together, these allowed for a radical religious individualism to take over. By any objective measure, I don't think I'm going out on a limb here too much, the Christian Bible is filled with some pretty esoteric and ambiguous imagery that is difficult to pin down and arguably impossible to fully understand. Prior to this, the Catholic Church was sort of a gatekeeper of these stories. With over a millennium of tradition behind them, they could parse out the Latin scripture pre-interpreted however they wished, since they were the only ones that could actually read the Bible. And in that sense, they preserved a social order that very much held European society together throughout the centuries and provided a stability that paved the way for the Renaissance and a massive increase in living standards throughout the continent. Once the words of the Bible and all their glorious contradiction and ambiguity were opened up to a much wider, non-professional audience, one that wasn't steeped in tradition and part of a massive bureaucratic institution, it was like Pandora's box opening up. Suddenly, everyone could interpret the scriptures themselves and come up with whatever conclusion they wanted. Everyone could be their own priest. This led to a radically varied interpretations as to how one should live and what one ought to believe. And in a society like 1500s Europe, religion was probably the most significant aspect of one's life. And this thrust society into a chaotic mishmash of different attitudes about what it truly means to follow God's word. On one hand, this new ability to read the Bible and interpret it yourself is liberating and wonderful and an enhancement of individual freedom. On the other hand, it led to incredibly dangerous situations. I think of it a little like how the invention of the internet got rid of the gatekeepers of truth, which is great, because so often, if only the most powerful voices can be heard, they'll further only the interests of the powerful. But at that same internet and its democratization of information also fosters the spread of what's come to be called fake news. Because any voice, no matter how batshit, is given a platform that can make it indistinguishable from the legitimately sourced, accurate news accounts. Freedom is a tricky business. In the 1500s, all over Northern Europe in particular, con artists created their own religions and exploited people's trust to satisfy their financial well-being and a variety of other more personal desires. Not only that, but it set up bitter conflicts between disparate sects that disagreed on this or that bit of scripture and created a raw tribalism that pit people against one another. As corrupt as the Catholic Church had been, at least they kept a sort of order in society. The printing press and the resulting Reformation blew the roof off the place and ushered in centuries of conflict. Most of the artwork we're going to discuss is pre-Reformation. And then later on, we'll get past that. But even the work that came before the Protestant Reformation reflects the attitudes that led up to it and that fed into the Reformation. And just some trends that we see in art that you could be looking for in the examples we're going to look at. The use of objects from the material world to symbolize spiritual ideas. The effort to make the divine accessible to us and part of our world. There's also an attention to clarity and detail, as we've talked about, often at the expense of creating a coherent sense of space. Protestant imagery tended to be more austere or severe and strict because they believed that devotional imagery could lead to idolatry. And there's always a meticulous attention to detail. And usually the brushwork isn't very evident, and that makes it like really illusionistic. Here's a map that centers on the important power centers and economic centers of Northern Europe. And this region has a rich history of painters. Maybe it has to do with the diffused light of the Low Country, but the imagery from these painters is often laden with iconography. And let's look at some. This is the Marode altarpiece by Robert Compen. It's meant for private devotion. In fact, it was commissioned by a layperson, not the church. And this represents a real break with the Gothic style that came before it. There's more focus on realism. It's a triptych. It's only 2 by 4 feet, which is pretty small compared to some of the pieces we've been studying. It features an Annunciation scene, the moment when the Archangel Gabriel announces to the Virgin Mary that she was the chosen one. And it has few of the religious formalities that we're used to seeing in religious paintings. No halos, for instance. And it's also set in a contemporary domestic setting of Northern Europe at the time. The patrons, which was the family who commissioned the piece, are presented on the left, looking through the door. And then we see on the right Joseph working in a shop. So it's a mixture of like secular and religious imagery. And it also, you might notice this kind of odd sense of space. So there's like linear perspective here, but like that bench, for instance, where Mary is like sitting and reading this book, is like just drawn out, and the tabletop is kind of upright, like it's going to fall over. And I think it's indicative of what you see a lot with the Northern European painters, that there's an incredible amount of detail and really focused on the objects that they're painting, but not so much of a focus on the sense of space and the setting that the objects are in. And so it's like hyper realistic, but not very accurate spatially. Here is it with the Italian Duccio version next to it, and you can kind of see what I mean by those differences and amount of detail in the Northern European art. Here's a detail shot showing how much detail is in the painting, the crisp lines and clean edges, and a little bit of the iconography as well. We see Mary, who's like on the floor, symbolizing humility, like kind of leaning against the bench, and absorbed in her scriptures, symbolizing piety. And I love this comparison shot. We see detail of this painting right next to the detail of Giorgione's painting from earlier in this, last week's lecture. And you could just see like how incredibly different this Italian, particularly Venetian sensibility of loose brushwork and kind of blended areas with the hyper detailed, fine point kind of linear work of the northern painters like Compen. And the little child flying with the cross symbolizes the body and soul of Jesus, transported on golden rays of light, representing Mary's impregnation. The cross he carries foreshadowing the crucifixion. Every speck of dust seems to be depicted in incredibly sharp detail. As we've talked about, the artists of the Northern Renaissance can make their paintings look very real in terms of details, but overall, the space and and the body don't look entirely real. It's a very different kind of realism than we saw with the Italian Renaissance. With the Italian Renaissance, the realism was based on the use of science, like anatomy, and math, like linear perspective and geometry. The realism of the Northern Renaissance was not based on science and math, but was based on a very close observation of the world. But even Compen's sense of detail pales in comparison to the master of 15th century Flemish painting. And that is Jan van Eyck, the true master of the medium of oil. And his work established a startling new realism. Van Eyck traveled to Italy and even met Masaccio. This is the Arnolfini portrait, 33 by 22 inches from 1434. And not really sure it's really the couple that it was originally thought to have been by art historians. This is a wealthy couple living in Bruges, and Bruges was an important trade city at the time. This piece is filled even more with iconography than Compen's painting we just looked at. We see the woman near the bed, symbolizing the domestic realm, the man near the window, bringing what he brings from outside the house. And the painting itself is an ostentatious record of social status. We see that this is a solid upper middle class family, not nobility, but doing well. We see the extra fabric in the robe, and all that extra fabric in that green robe would be have to be held up by a maid as the woman of the house is walking. We see the fur-lined coat. We also see the exotic fruit in the windowsill, and the very ornate mirror, and even a pet dog. And this isn't like a dog like workers would have. This is a useless dog. It's only there to be a pet, as an ornament that isn't going to actually contribute any work to the household. All these things are symbols, very conscientious symbols, and indications of wealth. Here's a detail with the wife. It's interesting. You see the way that she's holding her belly and sticking out. Probably she's not pregnant here. This was just a posture that was very fashionable at the time. However, fertility is alluded to in the color green of the robes, and even the carving on the back of the chair indicates Saint Margaret, who's the patron saint of childbirth. More details: the removed shoes, sacred nature of the event. Shoes are also a common gift to the wife from the husband. And here's a detail of the little doggy. This shows razor sharp eye for detail. More real than real. And in fact, one thing about Van Eyck that I think is interesting is the detail in his painting shows more than you would ever see with the naked eye standing in that same place. Northern Europeans relished that sort of thing. It's like each mark is so fine that it's made by a single bristle of the brush. And then we see his very odd signature here, very, very prominent in the painting. Van Eyck was here, like he was a witness. Look at the detail in the mirror. The one candle that's lit is perhaps symbolic of the light of Christ. It's also, candle is typical in a Flemish wedding ritual. Here's another painting, this time by Rogier van der Weyden, who was another Flemish painter who is actually active in Florence in Italy as well as in Brussels. This is a panel painting, and his works are often panel paintings with slender, elegant figures and with emotional tension. This artist was known for creating altarpieces, which are backdrops for the Christian Mass. They're multi-panel paintings with hinges that can be opened or closed, and scenes are painted on all sides, and different positions of the painting could be viewed at different times. And often these told narratives that reinforce church doctrine. Stories were really easy to read, and they were purposely simplistic in the imagery to be conveyed to illiterate masses of people, and lots of iconography. This is Descent from the Cross, or Deposition, 1435. The figures are compressed into a gilded niche, like a relief sculpture, and there's a shallow sense of space, but yet convincing. And that shallow sense of space, like there's not like a deep like landscape that they're in, they're more like kind of packed in. That really focuses the viewer's attention. We see Mary in a blue gown, symbolic of sadness, overcome with emotion, and St. John trying to hold her. Joseph of Arimathea is there, the one in the fine clothes, the man who donated his own prepared tomb for the burial of Jesus after the crucifixion. He's one of two to take away the body of Christ. The other one is Nicodemus. The 10 large figures, all densely packed within what looks like a shrine, are trapped within a space which measures approximately 8.5 feet by 7. There's drama and pain that seems to break the boundaries of the painting. Tightly interlocked figures seethe in a convulsion of anguish, passionate loss, and sorrow. Here's a detailed shot of the head of the Virgin Mary. You can see the precise detail in the painting. Every nuance of the texture is captured. And then there's Mary Magdalene on the right with a low-cut dress. And we don't see any classical motifs like we saw in the Renaissance paintings from Italy. The classical era just wasn't as much of an influence in the Northern Renaissance. And, what happened to our geometric clarity and that it's not present with these artists as much. Next, we'll look at perhaps the most fascinating of the artists of the Northern European Renaissance. If you can even call his work Renaissance is a tricky notion, but the time period of the Renaissance. Hieronymus Bosch, a very mysterious individual, little is known about him, and evidently he lived his entire life in the same little town. And he became popular as a painter in his time. His works often show like a real anti-humanist pessimism about humanity. Very judgmental, very moralistic, and there's sometimes so much emphasis on immorality that a person wonders about his own inner desires. That phrase, "thou doth protest too much," might apply. And, there's certainly plenty of contemporary examples of people who are the most outraged at a behavior, who secretly kind of want to behave the same way. Think of the TV evangelist who preaches homophobic fire and brimstone and then gets caught with male prostitutes. And either way, Bosch's work often seems to celebrate the very sinfulness that it condemns. Here's the Garden of Earthly Delights. It's oil on 3 wood panels from 1505. And, it's significantly more medieval than Renaissance in its theme. We see a prominence of sexuality that stems from this medieval obsession with the sin of lust. But it's almost like a guilty voyeuristic pleasure just to look at it. In this installation shot, you can kind of see the structure of these panels. So this is a triptych, a 3-part kind of painting. And the imagery, kind of like the altarpiece we just looked at, is painted on both sides of the edge panels. And, but likely, even though it has a format of an altarpiece, likely this isn't meant for a church. This painting is his most ambitious work. Loads of complexity, vivid fantasy-like imagery. Is it a didactic warning of the dangers of temptation, or possibly a panorama of a paradise lost? Each panel is a separate story. Let's have a look at it when it's closed. When its edges are folded in, it's a very different kind of painting. We see gray tones, typical of Netherlands style, probably meant to kind of by contrast intensify the color on the inside when you open it up. And when it's closed, it depicts the creation of the world. We see God in the upper left with a papal crown, and sort of a hesitant expression you can see in the detail shot there. No human life is yet present. The sea surrounding the land in the shape of a sphere, but not in the sense that we think of the Earth being a sphere. And this is what it looks like when it's opened. And the whole thing is meant to be read from left to right. And the center panel is the main story. This is the Garden of Earthly Delights, flanked by Eden on one side and hell on the other side. And it tells the story of humanity, the innocence of the Garden of Eden, and then temptations that lead to immorality that take up the bulk of the action in the middle, and then the wrath of God's judgment on the right. So the left side, the Garden of Eden, the relatively tame panel, we see the creation of Eve. Adam awakens, is presented with a partner, and is it almost a seductive gaze? I don't know. Rabbits are all around in the obvious symbolism, like bunny rabbits, and a phallic symbol in the upper area. But it's also the doom of humanity from the beginning, original sin. It's a prefiguration of the Protestant philosophy that's going to come a little later than this, that man is in a state of sin from the moment of conception. People are corrupt by nature. As I said, even before the Reformation, a lot of the attitudes that led to it were prominent in Northern Europe. Let's look at the middle panel. The Garden of Earthly Delights, a massive landscape of fantasy creatures and people engaged in orgiastic sexual acts and frolicking playfulness. And it's most every kind of act you could imagine, and some that you probably can't. Notice the odd scaling of the figures. We see these like birds that are impossibly giant, and fruit, and just a very, very disorienting sense of scale. We see wild primitive men covered in hair, and cherries, which were a symbol of pride, and lots of exotic and otherworldly objects. So all the free love kind of imagery is mostly interpreted as the corruption and immorality of humanity, not so much a celebration. And the right panel is the hellish landscape of horror. Humans who have succumbed to temptation now reap eternal damnation. Once frolicking naked people now cover themselves in shame. People are thrown into a burning lantern. There's vomiting, shitting, crucifixion on musical instruments. You can see this like kind of weird tree-legged man with the eggshell torso. That's possibly a self-portrait of Bosch himself when you see the face there. And then the top of the head are these bagpipes, which are symbols of sexuality. You see a ladder with a guy with an arrow stuck in his butt. And then men sitting around as if in a tavern. There's a detail here on the right of the Birdman, or perhaps the Prince of Hell, feasting on people, then crapping them out. And all over this painting is this odd preoccupation with excrement and sodomy. Here we see a pig dressed as a nun that reflected the growing anger over corruption in the church. As we said, an attitude that sets the stage for the later Protestant Reformation. It's safe to say that Bosch became very influential to later European artists and junior high boys everywhere. It's easy to see the connection to artists like Salvador Dali in this case. Now let's take a look at what was happening in Germany in the early 1500s, art-wise. Keep in mind, Germany is a fantastic location in a lot of ways. It's on the trade routes between the Netherlands and Italy, which were the two kind of real economic centers of Europe. And possibly Germany's greatest artist of the day was Albrecht Dürer. He was often referred to as Leonardo of the North. Here are two self-portraits. Albrecht Dürer really helped bring Renaissance ideas to Northern Europe, and he was sort of a Renaissance man himself. He had an intense curiosity of the natural world, mathematics, and in his artwork he was known especially for his use of line and, again, very, very fine details with crisp, descriptive imagery. Dürer went to Italy to study as a youth. It was part of his Wanderjahr, or like wander year, which is a German tradition where you take time off after your apprenticeship to learn skills from others and to see the world before you kind of really entered it in your profession. And he translated what he learned into the language of Northern Europe. So he takes all this knowledge from Italy and brings it and makes it kind of his own. He was a classic kind of tortured artistic soul, possibly sympathetic to Martin Luther, who gains prominence as Dürer is entering his mid-career. And he was an amazing painter, a very rich color and sense of depth, but he was especially famous for his prints. Here's an engraving from 1504, Adam and Eve. Featuring Old Testament imagery, which was a very popular theme in the 1500s, also in particular the Garden of Eden, the fall of man, original sin. All of these are very important ideas. And after his time in Italy, the classical Renaissance idea of the perfection of human form is something that he made him very interested in anatomy, and it corresponding to a system of proportions. And in that sense, there's this like kind of classical contrapposto symmetry in the two poses of Adam and then Eve. One leg locked, the other leg bent, one arm bent, the other one straight. This was modeled after classical sculptures that had recently been excavated, and Dürer saw these on his trip. Adam pulls a branch from the mountain ash, the tree of life. The specifics of this engraving are known because of the detail. We even see Eve, with the fruit from the forbidden tree of knowledge. Oops. And like all good Northern European Renaissance works of art, their iconography is everywhere. The animals are, signify the four temperaments or four humors. The rabbit, optimistic and sensual, the ox, calm and serene, the cat, grumpy and choleric, and the elk is melancholy. Before the fall, these temperaments were held in check by innocence. But once the tree of knowledge is eaten from, watch out. They all come to life and innocence is lost. You might wonder how engraving works. It's a type of printmaking. Printmaking is taking an image and then making multiple copies of it through transferring it. Printmaking is a relatively new art at this time. There were early woodcuts at the start of the 1400s, and engraving came along after that. Printmaking made possible multiple copies of an artwork, so it opened the exposure of art to a much wider audience. And because when you did one, you could make a whole bunch from it, made artwork much less expensive than an original painting would have been, and images could be disseminated to a wide audience. And this goes for writing as well as pictorial images. Of course, Martin Luther's 95 Theses came at this time and could be shown to people everywhere, and his ideas consequently went viral in Northern Europe. Printmaking pretty much changed the world. So the way the engraving process works is you carve fine lines into a metal plate, and then cover it with ink, and the ink settles into the grooves. So then you wipe off the plate and the ink stays in that grooves. And then as you press paper to the plate, you can get pretty clear, clean images that transfer from those grooves onto the paper. And while you're carving out the imagery, you can periodically stop and do a test print to see what it looks like, which is what Dürer did in this case. And here's another print by Dürer, the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. And this one is a woodcut. And woodcut is a bit more coarse than with an etching or engraving. You can compare these two detail shots. On the upper left, the woodcut of the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, and the one on the right in the lower end is a detail shot of the engraving we just looked at, the Adam and Eve. Notice quite a bit more information is capable in the engraving process. The woodcuts are made by cutting into hunks of wood and gouging out areas and then rolling the ink on the block, and the areas that aren't gouged out are the areas that hold the ink. And then the cut areas remain the color of the paper. So it's like the inverse of engraving, and you can understand when you see that you're cutting directly into wood. It isn't possible to get quite so much detail, but the marks are very expressive in woodcutting and in a woodcut, and of course there's a bigger challenge in that you have to contend with the grain of the wood, which is probably where that phrase "going against the grain" comes from. And in keeping with his Northern European counterparts, Albrecht Dürer presents us with a frightening vision of doomsday, where the human race is trampled under the horse's hooves. The crowding and angularity is very much a Gothic kind of style, but the believable sense of mass and space is very much a Renaissance style. Finally, we'll have a look at Matthias Grunwald. He was an acquaintance of Albrecht Dürer, but never went to Italy himself. This is the Isenheim altarpiece from around 1515. We see another multi-panel altarpiece, and this was done for the hospital for sufferers of an awful skin disease. Here it is in its closed position. We see the proportions are somewhat exaggerated. We see this grotesque image of Christ with the emphasis on pain. Not so much the beautiful at all. We see the arms torn from their sockets. And John the Baptist on the right pointing his finger, saying, he must increase, I must diminish. The words kind of like a cartoon kind of coming out of his mouth there. St. John the Evangelist holds the Virgin Mary, Mary Magdalene weeping on the ground with an ointment jar. And then we see this lamb with the cross bleeding into the chalice, which symbolizes Christ's sacrifice. And it's an image of hope and salvation amidst the torture and suffering. The tomb in the lower panel, we see it's broken right where Christ's legs are. It separates it into two sides. And there's a reason for a lot of this we're going to talk about in a little bit. Nothing's like to chance. Everything has its own kind of symbolic meaning. We see Saint Sebastian, who was on the left-hand side, that was martyred by arrows and suffered intensely when he died, and who is the patron saint of the plague. We see Saint Anthony on the right panel, an early Christian ascetic monk. He was tempted by psychic attacks from the devil, and also the patron saint of skin diseases. The monks of the Order of St. Anthony, whose hospital this was made for, were able to treat ergotism better than anyone else around by using a combination of ointments, baths, and amputations. So all of these kind of symbolic things that are happening in this painting were done in a particular context of the location in which this painting was hung. So St. Anthony's fire, another name for ergotism, was often fatal, and people got it from eating grain products that were contaminated with fungus, and it created convulsions, hallucinations, and gangrenous limbs. LSD is a synthetic derivative of ergot, and it's not the same thing physically, but the mental part of the experience is probably similar. It's kind of like the worst bad trip ever. According to one writer describing it, a great plague of swollen blisters consumed the people by a loathsome rot, so that their limbs were loosened and fell off before death. Sufferers go berserk and develop gangrene in the hands and feet due to constriction of blood supply to the extremities. Victims had the sensation of being burned at the stake before their fingers, toes, hands, and feet just dropped off. Chronic ergot poisoning was rife during the Middle Ages due to the consumption of contaminated rye. This was painted for the hospital in the monastery of St. Anthony, for obvious reasons, to relate to the suffering of Jesus, the experience that people who were unfortunately in this hospital were going through. And you could, like this image here, along with the painting next to it, you can kind of get a sense of context of what it might have been like going through that kind of suffering for the patients. And keep in mind too, hospitals at this time were not so much places you would go to get healed or to get better. They were mostly a place where you go to die. And think of it, like all of these people suffering in this one room. You can just imagine it would have been a real hell on earth, hearing the other people crying out in pain, suffering moans all day and all night. Clearly, the patients would be able to identify with the pain and suffering of this image of Christ. However, this is an altarpiece with multiple positions. And there were 3 of them depending on the day of the week. In the middle position, you see something very different from what it looks from the first version we looked at. As it opens up, we see scenes of hope. The Annunciation on the left, a concert of angels, and Madonna and Child in the middle, and then on the right is the resurrection of Jesus. This is a bright, clean, sunshiny Jesus, remarkably Germanic-looking Jesus, and a smile on his face. This is a final resurrection after death, which is a crucial part of Christian dogma. But also think of what the Christian idea of salvation meant to these particular patients. That once all the suffering is done and they finally die, that heaven awaits and there's a better place. And it's certainly intended to give comfort to the suffering. So it's a little like a before, after. So that's it for this lecture on the Northern Renaissance and Reformation. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.